Welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today we're going to do a little bit of a chat video. I'm going to share with you a little bit about orchid names and how people pronounce them, and also just figuring out is there a right way to pronounce these names, and also does it even matter? The world of orchids is widespread and it is a global hobby and industry. So of course you're going to encounter a lot of different languages and names and ways to say things, and I'm going to share with you kind of my perspective on it and how that impacts how I grow in this hobby. So to give a little background, most orchid names tend to have a scientific name and a common name. For example, the Phalaenopsis amabilis is the scientific name, and the common name would be the moth orchid. And there are a lot of common names for some of these plants, and there's a lot of scientific names to determine the species and hybrid of all of these orchids. The scientific names of most of these orchids are based primarily with Latin or Greek languages. So that's how you get the names of a lot of these plants. So to start, I'm going to go with the genus of a plant. The genus of most of these orchids are Latin or Greek based, like Phalaenopsis or Paphiapetalum. However, there are some that are actually named after people. So when you have a genus named after a person's name, you would pronounce it how the person would pronounce their name. For example, Cattleya is pronounced this particular way because it's named after William Cattleya. And I've also heard a lot of people call it Cattleya. And I know some people get really interested and really excited about this. So I kind of want to see where you draw the line on these things, because I found it to be the case that there are regional differences, there are accents, there is kind of a global pronunciation about them depending on your native language, and that may dictate how you say certain things. So to continue on with the genus, another one is Brassivola. I've heard people say that it is pronounced Brassavola after Antonio Brassavola, and that is the Italian pronunciation of it. So it's kind of interesting to see how there is a difference in pronunciation and emphasis, and how the genus can be pronounced. Now, the one that I find most interesting is Neo-Phoenicia, and that is the most common way I have heard this word being pronounced. But I've heard that it is named after a French explorer named Achille Finet. Now, if you're going to take his name and apply it to Neo-Phoenicia, I think most people say that it could be pronounced as Neophaneia or Neophanetia. However, this is a little bit of a moot point for this particular genus because a lot of the plants in this group have been renamed and reclassified as Vanda. So you may see this particular genus listed as Vanda falcata now instead of Neo-Phoenicia falcata. Also, I find it interesting how Americans pronounce certain words versus other languages. And for me, I am really big on growing catasetums, cygnoches, and cloacias. And I watch a lot of Portuguese and Spanish videos, and they always pronounce it as cloacia, catasetum, and cygnoches. Cygnoches is really interesting because Americans tend to pronounce it as cygnoches or cygnoches. Moving on from the genus, we're going to go to species. Now, once again, most species are pronounced in that Latin and Greek base. Once again, if it's named after a person, it should be pronounced how the person would pronounce their name. So there are a few ways to pronounce some of these terms that I've heard, and you can tell me which one is considered most correct and which one that you've heard pronounced. So the first one is Schilleriana, and this is primarily talking about the Phalaenopsis schilleriana, which is a very famous species. I've also heard it as Scaleriana. The next one is Warsawitzii. I think there are two ways in which to pronounce this one. This one is Warsawitzii or Varsavicii. What's interesting about species is that not only is the pronunciation either Latin-based or based on someone's name, but also what I call insider information. If you are part of a group, there's a common way that people say it, and it may not be exactly what is written on a document or what is written formally. An example of this is the Paphiapetalum balachum. Now, If you were looking at the word and trying to read it formally, it would be bolotulum. But I think most people who are really into the hobby, they would pronounce this as bolachum. I'm still getting the hang of trying to figure out what is the proper name for things, so please excuse me if I do say these words wrong or pronounce them incorrectly, because I am still learning as I go, and if you know more information, please share and please let me know. So not only do we have all of these things to consider about pronouncing the names, but what is the correct name for a plant anyway? I've realized that some plants go by multiple names, and by being aware of that, you will be able to avoid getting duplicate plants in the future, or kind of being disappointed when you realize, oh, this is exactly the same plant that I had, and I just didn't know it was under a different name. One of them is the Phalaenopsis tetraspis, which also goes by speciosa. And I think in Asia, they still use speciosa a lot as a separate species, and in America, I think most of them go by tetraspis. Another one that has kind of that similar identity crisis, I want to say, is Phragmipedium schlemmii. I've heard that several species of Phragmipediums are actually the exact same species, but it just has varying degrees of expression, and because of that, it is not a different species, but it's the same one. So I believe Fischeri and Andreatte is about the same species as the schlemmii. I think there's still a little bit of taxonomical confusion about these plants, so don't use my word as the standard, but just know that the names have tend to fluctuate and change over time. Now, moving away from the genus and the species, we're going to move into hybrids. When it comes to hybrids, anybody who's made a hybrid can register the name. Because of the variety and the breadth of all of these names, this is where it becomes tricky to figure out how to pronounce the name properly. I think a lot of English names are pretty easy for me to pronounce, but I know as you get into other languages, it tends to be a little bit tricky. What I've noticed is that a lot of Phalaenopsis are being created in Taiwan and in China, and so a lot of the names have a Chinese romanization written into it. So like a famous hybrid would be the Taishin flying eagle. This was really interesting because when you look at the plant name written down, you would pronounce it as Taiying Shin flying eagle. So I looked kind of into the background of that, and that's actually the name of a nursery in Taiwan. And in Mandarin, it's pronounced Taishin. My Mandarin is not really very good, so apologies if my accent is incorrect. And I believe that means happy corn. It's a little bit different than Taiying Shin, but I guess it's close enough. This plant also has a Chinese name. If you were to read it in a different dialect, for me, that would be Cantonese. If I read this, it would actually be called Tingmun. That doesn't sound anything like Taiying Shin. I guess the language that you use is important because that also determines how you would say the word. So to wrap up this video, I just wanted to share with you a couple of things I found interesting about pronunciation of orchid names and kind of the background and history of these names. I guess I just wanted to broach the subject as a way to open a conversation and figure out, how important is it to pronounce the name properly, and is there a right way to pronounce it, because there are regional differences, there are accents, and there are language barriers. And so all of these things combined can make pronouncing orchid names quite a challenge and quite difficult, because some of these words are actually not based in Latin, and so that can kind of ruin or change how you would say something. But not everybody has the time to really dive in and research, where we get this name, what is the background of it, what is its original language, and all of that to figure out what is the correct pronunciation. Personally, I feel like I'm going to pronounce it as best as I can given the information that I have. Whether it's I've heard someone say it or pronounce it this way, whether it's like a nursery owner or a more established orchid grower has pronounced it this way, or even regionally, this is how people around me pronounce this term. And in some ways, it's something that I came up with myself because I haven't heard people pronounce it, and this is the best way I think it's how it should sound. So that's how I'm trying to figure out how these names came to be and how to pronounce them so that I can communicate effectively and so that you will know what I'm talking about. I do think pronunciation is very important, and especially as an English speaker, and this is not my first language, but it is my primary language. I really stress on trying to figure out what is the proper way or what is the best way to say something. I think in the United States and with American English, you can kind of get away with some mispronunciations because of slang or regional differences or accents. So it's not as difficult as I would say like Chinese or especially Cantonese, because in Cantonese we have different tones, and that can change the meaning of something very drastically if you mispronounce a tone. Now most people will understand what you're saying, but still it can make for some very interesting miscommunications. So I will leave you with an example. In Cantonese we call orchids lam fa. And if we wanted to say a big orchid, we would say dai lam fa. However, if you mispronounce the first tone and say da lam fa, that actually means to hit an orchid. So if you go to an orchid nursery in Hong Kong, for example, and you say you want a big orchid and you say dai lam fa, but you mispronounce it and you say da lam fa, I think you might get a very questionable look. So instead of saying I want a big orchid, you might have said I want to hit an orchid. And that nursery owner will be very upset because I don't think anybody wants you to hit an orchid. So I'll just leave it at that about orchid pronunciation. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, Attainable Green, to follow along on my orchid growing journey. Happy holidays, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!